Hello, and welcome to This Conversation Matters, a weekly show about the social issues shaping our communities, from race and inequality to justice, economic opportunity, and overall well-being. I'm Sheree Curry. Each week, I speak with experts and people with lived experience to help you better understand why these issues matter in our lives. Go Down Moses, a spiritual with deep meaning for Jews and Black Americans. I'm both Black and Jewish, and our topic today is the intersection of these two communities. Jewish families will retell the story of Exodus during Passover this week, and later on April 4th, we'll mark the anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The histories of Black and Jewish communities in America have often been intertwined in faith, in struggle, in solidarity, and sometimes in tension. So today on This Conversation Matters, along with Laurie Fitz, we're exploring that shared history with two guests. First, Dr. Yohuru Williams, founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas, and then journalist Robin Washington. A longer version of this episode, produced by Kit Bix, first aired on Laurie's Connections Show on AM950 as a part of the Jewish Voices series. So thank you to Laurie, who will kick us off with the first question.
So tell me a little bit about the Black and Jewish alliances.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons, too, that I created the blackandjewish.org.com site more than 20 years ago, because we don't want people to think that Jews are all white. There are also Jews of color. There are also Black Jews, very multicultural. And there's this history, which is why we have Dr. Yohuru here as well to speak about the history of how Blacks and Jews have worked together because of commonalities and with discrimination in this country. And at the same time, there became a period where
Things
they didn't
strained.
work. Yeah, it was strained. And the PBS series that Yohuru was a guest on talks a little bit about both of those as well.
I'm going to jump in and actually introduce Dr. Yohuru Williams. You are a distinguished university chair and professor of history and founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas. You are a frequent expert on the History Channel and PBS, including the 2026 PBS special, Black and Jewish in America, an Interwoven History.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you. It's an honor to be here with Dr. Yohuru Williams. We are also colleagues. I appreciate your being here. And then in talking about this show, to the Black and Jewish in America, and it has 4 episodes to it, and it starts off with the Seder table with Jews of color around the table, along with non-Jews as well. Tell us a little bit, since you were featured as an expert on this show, how did you become involved in it? I think you know Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. You worked with him maybe before.
We've worked together before, but I actually don't know him. And I was a little surprised when I got the call for this particular project because as an expert in African American history, I anticipated that when they wanted to talk about this, they wanted to talk about the fracture point. Typically, as a 20th century U.S. scholar and as a scholar of the civil rights and Black power movements, that conversation typically pivots around the moment in which the Black and Jewish alliance crumbles in the mid-1960s, late 1960s. So the way the arc typically goes is that you have a conversation that begins really with the formation of the NAACP and Jewish scholars and activists who are very active in terms of promoting that work.
And very intentional.
Incredibly so. In fact, you have someone like W.E.B. Du Bois describing Joel Spingarn as both a scholar and a knight for his commitment to civil rights and racial justice for Black Americans. By the 1960s, it reaches its crescendo with the support of the civil rights movement by the Jewish community. But in the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in particular, and as that movement begins to move north, that complexity of that relationship reveals itself in ways that begin to reveal kind of fissures in that structure. And that's where I thought they were going to ask me to talk about. But in fact, Skip really wanted to explore the deep complexity and the deep relationship that these two communities have. So I loved being part of this because we don't often get a chance to talk about it. At least I don't get a chance to talk about that.
And we'll start a little bit too with more recent history than the history that happened, decades ago. So Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. was saying he came up with the idea for this series after the 2017 Torchlit March in Charlottesville, where there were white supremacists who were using anti-Semitic and anti-Black rhetoric. And this was also, in 2015, we had the mass shootings of Blacks in Charleston. There was also, around that time, a year or so before, the shooting of Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue. We continue to see a lot of, there's data that shows race-based hate crimes. Black people are the targets of the majority of that. Roughly 2/3 of religion-based hate crimes are targeted towards Jewish people. So 2015, 2017, this is not that long ago. What's going on today, and then how does the PBS series help to shine a light on some of this?
I wasn't surprised to learn that about Skip and being influenced by that moment, because that moment was very jarring, I think, for a lot of people who are familiar with this history. And it was interesting that it took place in Charlotte, because here's a site Charlottesville, that we associate with the American Civil War. And Americans love to say, that's not who we are. But when we talk about anti-Semitism and racial prejudice, that's exactly who we are. And Charlottesville revealed it in a way that in this site, which we associate with the Civil War and Reconstruction, this moment where the nation seemingly overcame, or supposedly overcame, this impulse toward segregation, you ultimately had the revelation in a way that was unmistakable of the continuing strains of anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism in the United States, which were the cornerstone of white supremacist beliefs and foundations. There's a reason why the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, the great civil organization or social organization it presented itself to be, is built on the foundations of anti-Black racism, anti-immigration, and anti-Semitism. So they have a long history and an interwoven history in that way. And when you heard those chants at Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us, it was linking both this celebration of Confederate monuments and Confederate history with this deep, ugly anti-Semitism, which lives both in conjunction with anti-Black racism, but also has some distinctive elements which we often overlook in talking about that relationship between the two. As you said, Sheree, when we think about this in terms of the United States, the most visible is what happens in terms of anti-Black racism. And anti-Semitism, in a way, gets only revealed in moments where it's unmistakable. And yet that strain is here and visible, I think, to those who are looking for it in ways that are unmistakable as well. So Charlottesville was one of those moments for a lot of people where it was a reminder. There's a reason why these two communities have shared this history. There's a reason why we're drawn to each other. It's a reason our stories resonate. There's a reason that when we talk about the Freedom Summer of 1964 and Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, that story still speaks to us. And there's a reason why Jewish activists, I think about Rita Schwerner in particular, when she takes that courageous step in 1964 of saying, look, my husband has been murdered, but when James Chaney's go missing, when Black people go missing, it's rarely. So kind of utilizing her privilege in that moment to draw attention to the treatment of Black Americans, but then at the same time, focus on the fact that Jewish people have often received that treatment as well, and that's where that sensitivity comes from. So Charlottesville, I think, was important for all of those reasons.
Charlottesville broke my heart because I actually went to the University of Virginia my first year. And it was in the 70s, and you kind of thought you were past all of that. And then to see your own school on the school grounds have that kind of chanting and that kind of hatred was a throwback to a time when people didn't say it out loud, and now they're saying it out loud.
I agree. I mean, and I think we're in a moment when the Trump administration in particular is giving people the permission to do that permissiveness. So we have devolved in a lot of ways. I was just speaking to someone about this the other day. This year marks the 100th anniversary of Black History Month. If we go back to 1976, when the U.S. is celebrating its bicentennial, you've got Gerald Ford saying to the American people, lean in and study Black history. And it's a pretty powerful pronouncement because what the president was doing in a moment when the nation is suffering from a malaise, a crisis of confidence, the
A
humiliating
division.
defeat in Vietnam. He's saying, well, one of the things that we can celebrate is look how far we've come with regard to race relations. Here we are on the eve of the 250th, and we've actually moved backwards. And the litmus test for that, again, isn't only in terms of the treatment of Black Americans, it's also in overcoming this divisive impulse that we see in terms of the treatment of immigrants, and certainly in the anti-Semitism, which has accompanied that anti-immigration impulse in American history.
And we have those areas, too, where we had President Barack Obama, and people say, well, we haven't gone back. Look at how much we have achieved as a country. But people do still see the anti-Black and the anti-so many other groups, you said immigrants and so forth. So, yeah, that's still interesting.
I love that you said that, Sheree, because people often talk about, or at least the administration talks about, Trump derangement syndrome. But one of the things that exposed kind of this deep, hidden, white supremacist foundation, again, kind of exposed the structure, was the election of Barack Obama. That moment where the rise of the Tea Party, the kind of destruction of the Republican Party as we knew it, and the emergence of the MAGA, which is deeply racist, deeply anti-Semitic.
And continues to attack Obama.
Yes.
It's still on their radar.
That's the Obama derangement syndrome.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, in looking at how both Blacks and Jews share a distinction of being primary targets of white nationalist ideology, how is the hate played out differently today? Do you see it?
It's such a great question because I think our communities are often pitted against each other. And we've certainly seen that in our contemporary moment. So rather than leaning into that shared history and the sensitivities that should come from two groups of people whose histories have been, in many ways, the script can be written through these ugly periods of pogroms or lynching, race riots. Often we're led to believe that we have less in common. In our contemporary moment, I think what worries me, and I think what really problematizes this for a lot of people, is this conflating of Israel with anti-Semitism here in the United States and how people react to kind of what they see as pro-Israeli stance without being able to be nuanced and understanding that you're talking about very different impulses, that not all Jews are Zionists, that Gaza is an issue as divisive as that was for some people. There are many Jewish people that spoke out and were opposed to what they saw as the same settler colonial impulse that led to the displacement of indigenous people in this country that was driven or by the same strain. At the same time, in the Black community, there is this latent anti-Semitism that people want to talk about. And sometimes it's not with regard to Black Americans, but those who've come from other countries who've had an experience with both Black Americans and Jews that kind of feeds that. And then last but not least, within the Black community itself, this fractured history, which I was very impressed that Skip got into in the documentary, around this notion that for the Black community, the Jews have often been the haves. So it's this impression that Jewish support of the Black community has been charitable rather than stemming from this kind of shared history of oppression. And we have to talk about the history of the Jewish people, and particularly here in the United States, as being a history that's steeped in oppression.
Yeah, and you brought up also about the relationship and how Blacks with Gaza and Israel, and you mentioned how not all Jews are Zionists. And then I have to also keep reminding, not all Jews are white. I lived in Israel for a year. And as a Black Jewish person, as well as for other Jews of color, that can be an interesting place to be where you do have African Americans who are looking at how are the Israeli government treating the Palestinians. And I saw some of that firsthand living there. And that has brought us to these other points of tension for, I'm going to say, white Jews in America and the Black Christian community. What are some of the points of tension as well?
There's so many, and I think it's important for people to recognize, as you just shared, Sheree, and I think the nuance that you bring to that conversation is very important, that ultimately this is the impulse whereby you lay at the feet of one individual or one administration attempt to lay the sins of an entire community. at the feet of the policies that are implemented by one administration or one person, so on and so forth. In terms of the Black Jewish experience in particular, when you note, for example, the fact that there are Blacks who are practice the Jewish faith, when we think about the connectivity in that discourse, it's important for people then to be able to appreciate the complexity of that relationship. That the pushback against what we saw in Gaza, as Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote, where he says, I went to Israel and I feel that the Palestinians are treated in the same way that Black people were treated, also then requires us to think about, but what has been the history of Jewish people globally in terms of encountering similar prejudice, and not solely looking at it in the context of what's happening in Israel. It's bigger than that. And so I think sometimes people get caught up in wanting to make a case that totalizes the experience of everyone in relation to, and then utilizing, I think in a way that's very harmful, the experience of the Holocaust to then say, well, everyone should know better or they should know better because of this experience. The exploitation impulse lives deeply within the human experience, and we all have a choice. We either embrace those stories which see our shared experience and our shared humanity as liberators, those who are lovers of liberty, who privilege human life and who work toward a beloved community that Dr. King envisioned, or those who are exploiters. And there are always going to be people who choose that. I choose to celebrate the history that positions us in terms of our shared humanity.
Thank you.
So as they stand today, we've got this onslaught. And we see in the past there's been housing issues and employment issues, and they're still relevant today. How do we navigate that?
We have to talk about it. I mean, I like to say that coming out of the optimism of the Civil War and Reconstruction, by the time we get to Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, you have these 6 degrees of segregation which present themselves. And these are firm obstacles to not just full equality, but economic opportunity for Black Americans in housing, access to places of public accommodation, unfair labor practices, and the most intractable and visible of those 6 degrees of segregation, Jim Crow justice, the way that Blacks were treated by the criminal legal system. Jews as immigrants, and just because of anti-Semitism, navigate those same questions. However, their whiteness allows them in some circumstances to circumvent or to avoid the most visible consequences of that. It is the difference between an Alice Dunbar Nelson moving to Wilmington, Delaware in 1903 and not being able to pass, and then being aware of Jewish neighbors who were able to because their skin gave them the privilege of not being recognized or othered in that way, as long as they weren't practicing Jews or overt in the display of their Judaism. Having said that, in an exploitative society, in order for people to survive in a capitalistic structure, there are always going to be those who are going to be pitted against one another because they're competing for meager resources which exist in the written off space for the others. And that has been the history of Blacks and Jews in many ways, particularly in urban centers. So if we think about the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, by the time we get to 1967 and you're talking about what's happening in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, New York, you have Black Americans saying, well, our teachers are the Jews, right? These Jewish teachers who work in our schools, and they're part of the system that exploits us and denies us access to our history. They have access to those jobs. They have access to opportunities that were denied us. Jews are not denied opportunity or access to the GI Bill, which is something that comes up in the documentary. And so that meant that access to housing, the ability then to transmit intergenerational wealth was something available to Jews that wasn't available to Blacks. At the same time, there are also stories within that, and I think the documentary does a good job of talking about this, where you have very principled people within the Jewish community who say, we recognize that. And so we're going to tackle that in the spaces where we have influence. And in the Black community, there's also this recognition that if we don't talk about this, and this is what's so important, what we get is a situation that we saw here in 2020 with George Floyd, where we forget that the tip of the spear is what happens in terms of George Floyd's treatment by those officers. The deeper questions is how people at 38th and Chicago have to survive in a system where that bodega on the corner overcharges for products and no one can explain why. Gas costs more in those communities, groceries cost more, so on and so forth. Jews historically have had to survive by being able to provide those goods and services in that system, exploited by the very same system, and then becoming the most visible, that you can kind of lash out and say, well, these are our enemies, but ultimately the system is what's broken, and the system is what we have to reform. Those differences then, I think, would be minimized, but it's very easy to focus on what's in your face as opposed to thinking about in a greater systemic way. How do we reimagine systems so that they don't grind people up and create those grievances or perpetuate those grievances?
And there's one too you brought up too with housing, for example, where the series talked about Levittown, created by someone who was Jewish, these tract housing, and yet blacks were still excluded from them. It was at a time, though, where we still had the redlining. You know, there was a time in history, too, where Jews were excluded from certain housing. Blacks were excluded from certain housing. But because of, you said, the whiteness of predominant Jewish culture, they were able to go in and, you know, create systems for housing for themselves. But at the same time, I think my interpretation is it was going to still be difficult for them to sell houses to black people because that was the America that we were living in at the time. And then you get this period where we talk about as black people do move into a neighborhood and white flight, they're moving out, and you have Jews who end up being some of the ones who also were renting or selling homes too, but let's say the renting. And then they're looked at, well, okay, are they also becoming the oppressor? Because now I have a landlord that, you know, are they charging me too much rent? There's so much history that crosses in different ways.
And they probably were, because that's the exploitative nature of capitalism as it functions perpetuates that, I think, in ways that then Jews unfairly are targeted as those people who are perpetuating a system which they inherit. And as you pointed out, Sheree, are victimized by redlining and exclusion in terms of the restrictive covenants. And then much later on, try to create communities. In some sense, it's a defensive mechanism, you could see, but then also leaning into the notion of whiteness as property. And we don't want to talk about that often in this discourse, but it's important. Whiteness is a currency. And so when you have Levittown, the idea is that if this is going to be an exclusive space, what is the definition of exclusivity in the United States? It means that these people can't come, right? They're excluded. And that was the model and the blueprint in the 1940s. It's the model and the blueprint today, that exclusivity, the fact that I live in a gated community. And what does that mean? When I erect that gate, it means that the people who live on this side of the gate, the people that I'm trying to keep out, don't have the finances, don't have the intelligence, don't have the culture that I have. So you're selling that illusion, you're selling that dream. And then when it becomes available to Black Americans, it's at a premium. The joke that I like to tell, which is not funny, is if we think about a show like The Jeffersons from the 1970s, to move on up and to move on out means, to, in some sense, to have to leave behind not just where you came from, but any notion that what you came from could ever produce anything that would be worthy of living on the other side of that gate.
And it becomes an assimilation.
Absolutely.
What strikes me in looking at the challenges between the Blacks and Jewish communities is that the system benefits from the anger. It benefits because if you have two communities fighting each other, they're not questioning into the system. They're not questioning into the people in power and question into for how we want to be as a country, as a democracy, as a people that welcome immigrants, as a people that welcome all. I mean, we're the only country that was founded on an idea.
Couldn't agree more. And yet I think at our 250th, the fundamental question today is this problem that has been raised by the Trump administration. Marco Rubio gives a speech in which they are promoting this idea that we're Western democracies, Europe and America, founded on a principle of white supremacy. So were we a nation founded on white Christian nationalism? Or were we a nation, as you said, founded on ideas? And this is important because if it's an idea or ideas, we're talking about a civil theology. Mm-hmm. And one of the key components of that civil theology is the idea that diversity is a strength, that immigration has benefited this republic, that those who've built it, although excluded, have been integral to its construction.
And we've asked them to come. Give me your poor. Give me your.
Absolutely.
They've said, please come to our country to build us up because we want to be a multicultural country.
Love that, but always with the paradox, because we think about the Statue of Liberty in particular. Mm-hmm. It's sent by the French to the United States in the 1880s to celebrate emancipation. But by the time it comes, the U.S. has already walked away from its commitment to Black Americans, so it has to be repurposed to celebrate immigration. And what are we doing in our contemporary moment but walking away from that commitment? Not the first time we've done it. You have this pushback against German Jews in the 1880s, which is expressed in some of the ugliest political cartoons from that period. And they're all about what will the Jews bring to this country? Sabbath desecration, poverty, disease. Ludicrous, because it denies, again, the rich traditions, customs, the innovation, the skill, the knowledge that those immigrants brought that contributed in the same way the Chinese and various other groups contributed.
And there were so many groups, too. So outside of the Jews, we talk about the immigrants coming in. Italians coming in at some point also were discriminated against. You could take any kind of group.
Us Irish.
Yeah. So it is interesting how we cannot still come together today as a whole, because all of our cultures at some point, the majority of our cultures, face some type of discrimination in this country. So why do we continue to perpetuate that against each other now?
We play a little bit of a competitive Olympics game in terms of oppression. Mm-hmm. And I think Congressman John Lewis probably asked the question in a way that authentically we need to ask it today. It's important for us, for example, it's a great example of Sheree with the Italians, the single largest group of immigrants subjected to lynching as a form of violence, where single largest lynching of non-African Americans is 11 Italians at the Port of New Orleans in 1891. But those individuals have a government that can speak up for them and say, you've killed our citizens. And once they determine that they're not Italian citizens, but citizens of the United States, they're like, oh, it's your problem. The reason I bring that up, though, is that it goes back to your point. We won't conquer that issue until we really deal with the group who has been the most marginalized, the most exploited. And so it means looking at that history and celebrating those connections, but then also saying, if we're going to fix any of these problems, we've got to look at the group that's been the foundations for them. And that's been Black Americans. So I think one of the things that we celebrate about, for example, the NAACP, Joel Spingiron, many of the prominent Jews who were active in the civil rights movement, they understood that. And they were saying, we understand that what produced the Holocaust in Nazi Germany is the same germ that produced segregation, inequality, that fed racism, that led to the dispossession of the lands of indigenous people here. And we want to conquer that. We want to conquer that the same way we conquered polio. It is a disease, and ultimately it will kill the body politic if it's allowed to flourish.
One thing that comes to my mind is, going back to that, when I created the forum for Black and Jewish, which was around the time my first son was born. And I like to say the future looks like my children. It looks like so many other people's children with the rise of multiracial Jews, not just Black Jews, right, but Latino Jews, Asian Jews. We've always existed, but there's a growing number. And so I like to hope there's more of an understanding among the white Jewish community as well about the richness that Jews of color bring to the tribe, as we call the Jewish community, the tribe. And so that's my hope. And that if we, as two groups, since this is about, Blacks and Jews, that those two groups, as white Jews and Black Jews, kind of see that we can also kind of stand as an example for the rest of America, as can so many other multiracial communities.
And Dr. Williams, what do you see?
It's such a great question, and I appreciate Sheree's work and that shared experience. I'm going to go back to John Lewis for just a second. In 2020, he wrote that final letter to the American people, which people always quote. I love the quote where he says, we need to get into good trouble, necessary trouble. I always say people didn't read the whole thing. He says, ordinary people with extraordinary vision have the power to redeem the soul of America by getting in good trouble, necessary trouble. And then he says, the way that we develop that extraordinary vision is through the study of history, our shared histories, not just the history of the United States, not just the history of Black Americans, but the history of every person in a way that we can authentically engage with one another, and through that understanding build coalitions that can break down the barriers to equality that have chained us for so long. I think about the Olympics, Suni Lee winning a gold medal for the United States and then immediately saying, as a Hmong American, I'm disappointed that so few people know anything about my history. And I'm not an immigrant. I've been here. We've made this contribution. Don't celebrate me as a Hmong American that's won. Celebrate me as an American that won a medal and that my Hmong ancestry is central to my identity. And the fact that you don't know means that you're at a deficit. People who want to be colorblind are problematic because they see everything in black and white. I want people to see in the rich, colorful tapestry of our shared humanity, but then also our oppression. That's what John Lewis meant in terms of really interrogating history as a means to develop extraordinary vision and go, hey, what we need to challenge and overcome is racial inequality, a denial of access to housing, gender discrimination, bias. And until it's taught without bias, we have to elevate the experiences of those who we don't know in order to correct the record, to allow us the vision to understand what we need to change.
And I know I think about this too from what you're saying. When people say, I don't see color, and to me, you also have to see the color, but without the bias. You have to see me for all of who I am. As a Black American, as a Jewish person, this is part of who I bring. As a journalist, this is who I bring to the table. So, yeah, celebrate the richness of us.
And do the work. We just have to sit in the discomfort. And Sheree, one of the things that I appreciate about your work in particular, you can't grow unless you're uncomfortable. Growth comes from discomfort. And I love that our communities, Blacks and Jews, are the model for how to do that. And that's why this history is so important.
Robin and I are both Black and Jewish. I've known Robin a long time, Robin Washington. So it's a pleasure to be able to have him as a guest. Robin, he created this documentary back in 1995, You Don't Have to Write Jim Crow, about the first freedom ride and the impact of Irene Morgan's refusal to yield her seat on a bus from Virginia to Maryland in July 1944. We'll hear a little bit from him about that. Robin is also Jewish. He is a moderator with me on the blackandjewish.org. He is a former editor-in-chief of the Duluth News Tribune, and currently he is a columnist for the Star Tribune, and he is an editor-at-large at the Jewish publication The Forward, and a radio host for Wisconsin Public Radio. He is also the parliamentarian of the National Association of Black Journalists Minnesota, where I am the co-president. But most importantly, I have to say this, Robin was also the guest speaker at my oldest son's bar mitzvah. So it was a pleasure to have Robin speak there. When we first met at a journalism conference at the National Association of Black Journalists, Robin was so excited to tell me that there are other Black and Jewish journalists who are also there. And he went around the conference with me until we found 10 of us so that we could have a minion at the journalism conference. So, Robin, it's such a pleasure to be able to do this with you today.
Thank you again.
When we talk about the Black and Jewish relations from going back to the civil rights era, we often hear about how much Jews were aligned with the causes for civil rights causes and allies of Black Americans at that time. And that PBS special, the Black and Jewish America series, speaks a little bit to that as well. What's your thought? You have done some research on that as well about the Black and Jewish alliances in the civil rights era.
Well, I've not only done research, I've lived it. I grew up in a civil rights movement family. My mother was an officer of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality in Chicago, and also of the NAACP. There were CORE and NAACP meetings in our living room. Wow. I was sitting there playing toy trains while she and her colleagues were figuring out sit-ins and boycotts in the early 60s. So the other thing I would point out, both in the documentary series and in reality, is the relationships between the larger Black community and the Jewish community, keeping in mind always that there are overlaps at both. It doesn't begin with the civil rights movement. Take me, for example. I was born in 1956. The movement had just begun. Obviously, my parents, one of whom was African-American and not Jewish, the other one Jewish and not African-American, found each other before I was born, right? And my brother was Syrians earlier, so that should tell you something. But in the documentary series, to his credit, It goes back way further than that. It's not, just Jews coming to the aid of blacks in the civil rights movement or for causes for black liberation. The converse happened in the early 20th century. Black newspapers were editorializing against pogroms going on in Europe. And so, this is a two-way street. And the two groups have always been basically allied against what? Oppression and discrimination, because both have been victims of oppression and discrimination. That has ebbed and flowed over the centuries and certainly over the decades, and there's different manifestations. But bottom line is, those who are racist are probably pretty much overlapped with those who are anti-Semitic. At the end of the day, both groups are fighting the same fight.
And I'm fascinated with you growing up in the civil rights movement. My mom was very active as well, and I always said that I learned how to walk in a march. So and she was active in the late 50s with helping with the desegregation of schools. So there was, a powerful movement that started with civil rights and with both Jewish and blacks being there was prejudice. So there was a reason to come together, but there was something more. Tell me about that.
Well, again, in our backgrounds are pretty much shared because, by the way, the fight against segregation in schools, particularly in the North, neighborhoods were, right? There were black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods, and each had their own schools. And there were also Jewish schools segregated, at least in Chicago. So you hear this a lot, that Jews joined the civil rights movement because it was their interest as well as being the interests of African Americans.
And often protections had been failed for both.
Absolutely. And
My mother grew up in Alabama until she was about 15 when the family migrated north to Chicago. But she grew up, she was born in 1947. So there were separate water fountains, we know, for Black people. There was, redlining continued with housing in terms of who could own land or who could buy certain houses or not. And Jews faced some of the same situations as well in America. When my mother moved, she was about 15 when she moved to Chicago. And that was the first time that she was in a school with white people, some of whom were Jewish people as well, in that part of the South Side of Chicago. And I know that when we talk about where those alliances come from, as Jews also were fighting about where they could live, in which homes they could buy or not, it helped to build the two together. But at some point, we know that there was a shift between that strength of an alliance in the middle of a civil rights protest to later when we go to, I'm going to go to like New York in Crown Heights in the 1990s between Blacks and Jews, it kind of erupted. And so from your perspective, where did some things fall apart and why?
as far as when it fell apart, it constantly falls apart. Okay. You take any two groups of people and they don't agree on something, even if they're in an alliance, and it comes back together again. That's, if anything, you're going to jump to what it all means and tell you it means, you know what? We actually care about each other because we wouldn't be worrying about the divisions if we didn't, right? If I can't stand you and when I get into a fight, good, go, bye. I don't need you anymore. But guess what? Blacks and Jews keep coming back to each other, right? And so there's periods in which there's great cooperation, there's great intermingling. I am the result of intermingling. Okay, so, there's literal evidence of that. And there's other times that we can't stand each other. It's because some of the, priorities changed. The quota system, for instance, because when affirmative action first began, in the very first days, under, by the way, I would say the Nixon administration, okay, but Jews reacted to this, or Jewish organizations, because wait a minute, quotas kept us out. So now you got a quota and we're not included in, fine. But so that was one point of division, okay. It changed later on when the quotas went away, and they didn't go away because of Jewish protests over it. They went away because of attacks against affirmative action and all. That, of course, continues today with attacks against the law.
Robin, you bring to light so many important ideas, but I also want to mention that I think both you and Sheree are celebrations of the Jewish and Black community coming together.
Let me
You
jump
both.
onto that really quickly to
Yep.
say that's the other thing that binds the two groups
Yep.
is, I mean, humor. I mean, Jewish Black comedians. You know, if you took away that, you wouldn't have comedy.
That's
Okay,
true. It's
you
true.
know, by the way, we wouldn't have much left in music either. You know,
Mhm.
so the collaborations are many, many, many. There are so many commonalities.
We talk about the comedy and the music. It's also where society, I mean, mainstream society, decades ago allowed us to participate. It was okay to white society to hear our music, to see us dance, to see us do comedy. Even to the extent, right, that we're talking about there was blackface where they wanted to imitate that. We were not in some of the circles of business. So this is where we were allowed to show up among the two groups or create your own business, which is what we saw the number of Black entrepreneurs, the number of Jewish entrepreneurs who had to start their own banks, their own colleges, looking at, right, historically Black colleges and universities, looking at yeshivas, Jewish universities. So there are certain spaces that we were allowed to be in with among mainstream, and then there were others that we had to create for ourselves.
Right.
I lived in Israel and worked in Israel in journalism covering immigration. There was the airlift of Ethiopian Jews around that time as well. There's a lot of Russian Jews who came into Israel, and looking at the dynamic of how the country absorbed Black Jews from Ethiopia and these white Jews who came in from Russia was a very interesting experience. I know with Robin's journalism, with both of our journalism and how we cover some of these issues. Robin writes for, let's say, The Forward, which is a Jewish publication that actually I believe it started out as a Yiddish publication. And he's also a columnist with the Star Tribune. And there is so much the impact of journalism and how it has had on the storytelling of any kind of communities. Robin, with the role that journalism plays in this, I look at, the 1955 murder of Emmett Till and how his mother said, let the newspapers print the photo of her son and the violence that occurred against him that caused his death. And the Black press was a part of that helped bring that to light. And when we bring that forward to today, just looking at the history of journalism as well, and we can talk about independent journalists like Georgia Ford here in our community, who was arrested, for covering an aspect of what was going on with the protest. Don Lemon, a national journalist who was in town for that as well at that same protest, was also arrested without the reporting from journalists, independent journalists, and now just people on the street, you know, as well. We need the documentation to help bring these stories, to the general public to know what is actually going on. I write about some of these issues. You write about some of these issues today, Robin. So how important is journalism in telling these stories?
Well, if you don't have journalists telling stories, we don't know what happened. And also you have many different versions of what happened. And of course, that's the challenge today because forget about what you and I write in mainstream newspaper or in radio station, whatever. Most people are getting their news by some kind of social media feed. And it might be true, it might not, it might be completely nutty. Well, who are these gatekeepers who decide what we see and what's, real or not? But on the other hand, we're in the Wild West right now, with anything being posted. And of course, even worse now with AI, right? Because you don't know what you're seeing.
And we've seen, right, from journalists, it also female journalists as well, right, being called stupid and ugly and piggy. We've heard that from the federal government as well.
You can say his name unless you don't want to say his name.
No, we can say Trump. We can say Trump.
It's actually important to
Yes.
attribute that one person because nobody else is saying this. Nobody else is posting.
Yeah. And I know when we talk about with the targets, whether it's women or Somalis, immigrants, Black journalists, When these things are said, even Muslims and Jews are being attacked in the media and in society. Our entire society is being weakened and whose voices can be heard. And I wrote a commentary in the Star Tribune back in December that kind of talked about that using the German pastors saying, like first they came for the socialists, who I did not speak out. Then they came for me, right? And there was no one left to speak for me. And I feel the same way with for journalism, so it's individual communities, but then it also becomes coming after the journalists as well. And if the journalists aren't here to help speak for the community and tell those stories, it erodes, how much we feel about what is truth, what is fiction out there in our society.
A question for you about what drew you to the documentary that you created on Irene.
So I grew up in the civil rights movement, and all these meetings were in my house. I knew the people who were out on the front lines and everything, leading stuff. I became a journalist, and for one short period of my life, when I got laid off, it's happens in journalism. I was looking for a job and got something in communications, public relations for a peace organization called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which it turned out had been a progenitor of several of the civil rights groups in the 1940s. I learned the history of the organization and found out the existence of a freedom ride, whites and blacks traveling in the South, purposely violating segregation laws, but not in the 1960s, in the 1940s, which I hadn't known about. I hadn't grown up in the 60s. And then I realized the writers were still alive. And although this was my one foray away from journalism, I ended up doing the most journalistic thing in my life and created a documentary about this freedom ride. So I'll say Irene right now. She was an African American woman who was between Maryland and Virginia, back being Virginia, Maryland. And she got on a bus in Virginia. She sat in the back where she was supposed to sit. And as the bus got crowded, more and more crowded, the driver said, "Give up your seats." And she said, no, she was already in the back. And so she was removed from the bus. She resisted. When the sheriff's deputy came out, she said that he put his hands on me, and that's when I kicked him. And so she was not violent. But long story short, it led Thurgood Marshall and Spotswood Robinson, two NAACP lawyers, took her case. They were looking for a case like this. And they argued it, ended up in the Supreme Court, here with me for a little technical stuff, not saying segregation was wrong, but saying that forcing her to move between different seats as the bus crossed the different state lines with different rules, Maryland was integrated, and Virginia was not, was an undue burden on commerce, as described in the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. And so because of that, the Supreme Court agreed and outlawed segregation in interstate travel between the states as an undue burden on commerce. They didn't say that segregation was wrong. It simply said Maryland and Virginia couldn't enforce each laws on each other. And so this was decided. But that was on June 3rd, 1946. On June 4th, 1946, things hadn't really changed in the South. We weren't enforcing this. So a group of really were gentlemen wearing suits and fedoras and all, but they were wild-eyed radicals. And they were black and white, and one was Jewish. And 16 men, 8 black, 8 white, decided to test the Irene Morgan decision by buying interstate tickets and traveling through the South and seeing what would happen. In short, and I found the survivors of that ride. There were 10 alive when I started. 3 died before we could start shooting. I raised the money. We put them on a bus, had them relive their trip, and shot it for PBS, and that's, you don't have to act.
And I wanted to go back to you, Sheree, in looking at the responsibility of journalists in telling the story and bringing that to life. What
Right.
now gives you your hope?
The role of journalists, is very important in these times. And we talk about Black journalists or Latino journalists, Asian American journalists, and journalists who are just out in the community. We have here in town the Sahan Journal, which covers a lot of immigrant and refugee communities, and people who can really identify and build these connections with people, not saying that mainstream journalists do not mainstream, meaning white journalists at mainstream publications, but the role of journalism is important overall, but definitely when you talk about the coverage of ethnic communities and how important that is when you kind of identify with that. So what brings me that hope is journalists are not stepping back. So even though people say that maybe we're not telling the truth, what is real journalism, what is not journalism, we're under attack, but we will still be out there covering these stories and seeking that truth without that spotlight for readers and hoping that readers can kind of understand what is actually going on. That's the important role. And it encourages me when I hear journalists say, despite these attacks, and despite layoffs, the Washington Post just laid off a bunch of journalists, they will find a way to then do their independent work and still bring stories forward. Thanks for listening today. I'm Sheree Curry, and this has been This Conversation Matters on Power 104.7, supporting the mission of the Minnesota chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists. Follow us on Instagram at NABJMN and me at Sheree Curry Media. And be sure to subscribe wherever you find your podcasts. Let's keep the conversation going.
Hey y'all, I'm Lizzie, and every week we take you beyond the story. An NABJ Minnesota program brought to you by All About the Culture in Power 104.7 FM. Beyond the Story introduces you to business owners, community leaders, and media professionals. Join us Tuesday evenings for Beyond the Story. Today we're talking with Jasmine McBride, Associate Editor at the Minnesota Spokesman Recorder, about her support of journalist Georgia Fort, who's facing federal charges for reporting about a protest in Minneapolis.
To your point about Georgia, I think it's a really interesting situation for me because this is a woman who will open the doors for me in terms of this career. And so I was faced with this very complex situation of fearing for my own safety, but feeling a sense of duty of showing up for my friend and for somebody who inspires me. And so I remember we had that press conference, at the Capitol, and I just was like, do I speak? Do I not speak? I remember I was not planning to speak, but then I was like, maybe I should say something, because I just really had to think about 10 years from now, what would have been the right choice? Like, not what I think is the right choice in this present moment, but after the emotions have kind of subsided and all of these that are presently happening, what decision would I be happiest with? And I felt like standing up for my friend was the right decision.
I'm Lizzie, and this has been Beyond the Story in partnership with This Conversation Matters.